In this interview, we have invited Professor Dr. Santhiram Raman to talk about the Tamil education in Malaysia. He is a retired professor of education in the School of Education, Languages and Communications, Wawasan Open University, Penang. He received his doctorate in educational policy studies at the University of Sussex, United Kingdom. He was a lecturer at the School of Educational Studies, University of Science Malaysia in 1985 and was promoted to associate professor in 1998. On retiring from USM, he joined KDU College Penang campus, University Brunei Darussalam and Wawasan Open University. His research interests are in the areas of education for ethnic minorities, educational policy analysis and history of education. He has written extensively on issues of minority education in Malaysia, especially for the Indians. He has authored books such as The Education of Ethnic Minorities, The Case of Malaysian Chinese, Education of Minorities, The Case of Indians in Malaysia and Educational Issues in Multi-Ethnic Malaysia. So let's watch the video.
Tamil schools in Malaysia have a 205-year history. The first Tamil schools were started in Penang Free School by Reverend Hutchings to provide some kind of Tamil education for children of Indian workers in the ports and the Public Utilities Department of the State Settlements Administration. Then, coming of the British in the British colonial rule to Malaya and the development of the economy, Indian labor, especially from the Madras Presidency of India, was brought in to open up estates and work in the rubber plantations as rubber tappers under the indentured system of labor recruitment. Thus, the Tamils from South India were brought into Malaya. They formed at least 85% of the Indians, while the rest was made up of Telugus, Malayalis, Punjabis, Sri Lankan Tamils, and Northern Indians. They made up the rest of the Indian population in Malaya. As such, the Indians themselves were separated by their linguistic and also their religious divisions. The British administration practiced a laissez-faire system where they allowed the immigrant communities, the Indians and the Chinese, to be responsible for their own education. And they only looked after the Malay primary schools. So for the Indians, the estate managements were made responsible for the education of the workers' children. But the estate managements were more interested in making profits for their shareholders rather than spending money on a social service for their workers. So they provided the barest minimum in terms of infrastructure and facilities and staff. In some instances, a dilapidated smokehouse doubled up as a school, and teachers came from any worker who was literate in Tamil language. But in 1923, the government introduced the labor ordinance, which made it compulsory for the management of estates to have a school in each estate where there were about 10 school-going children or more. In the urban towns, Tamil schools were also set up by the missionary bodies, also the colonial governments. By 1938, there were at least about 547 Tamil schools in the Federated Malay States and the Strait Settlements. And by independence in 1957, there were 888 Tamil medium primary schools in the country. There were about 2,144 Malay primary schools and 1,275 Chinese medium primary schools in Malaya at that time. Let us look at the problems faced by Tamil schools around that time. For one thing, Tamil schools were regarded as the poor man's school because they serve the poor sections of the Indian community. This is because, and they didn't have proper infrastructure and facilities. This is because there was a colonial rule that the administration would not spend on developing the infrastructure if the school stood on private land. So they wouldn't provide development funds. So there were no development funds available to improve the schools in these areas until about 1957. And the quality of education was low as the teachers were not trained. And also about 60% of the schools were classified as small or under-enrolled schools. In some cases, they only had about between 11 to 25 students. And they practiced what is known as multiple class teaching in these small schools. That is, in one classroom, there were either 3 standards in standard 1, 2, 3 in one class, and standards 4, 5, and 6 in another class. So Tamil education was dead end or terminal in nature. The students could not proceed beyond the primary school level. This was to ensure that these children stayed within the estate world. Before we look at the Indian students' problem, we'll have to find out what happened to the Indian community in the estates. That's very important for us. After independence, European plantation owners who were returning home started selling off estates to the local entrepreneurs. The new local owners started to subdivide and fragment the huge estates into smaller units to sell their lots to other locals. This led to a massive displacement of the Indian workers. These Indians who had enjoyed the security of the estates now had no jobs or a place to stay and started moving to the urban areas and towns, lacking in education, proper education, lacking in savings or skills needed for life in the urban area. They ended up becoming the urban poor, living in squatter areas and low-cost, high-rise buildings, and working as menial workers. You would see the magnitude of this problem when you look at the statistics. Presently now, if you look at the statistics, 89% of the estate Indians are in the urban areas, 89. And only about 11% are in the plantation sector, living under very difficult and trying circumstances because estates have been broken up. Small holdings or small owners did not provide them the kinds of facilities that were needed to maintain a decent standard of life in these subdivided estates. Now the problems was, now we have about 527 Tamil primary schools in the country, and a big number of these schools are still lacking proper facilities and buildings because of that old archaic colonial rule. Teaching may have improved, but the standard of Bahasa Malaysia in these schools is still a worrying factor among the Indians. This problem, among other things, has continued to plague the Indian students in the secondary schools. The other problem is the removed class. The removed class was introduced to improve the proficiency of Bahasa Malaysia among these students. But these classes have not been accorded the status of a remedial class, so as to prepare the large number of Tamil medium and Chinese medium primary school children to make the switch to Bahasa Malaysia in the secondary school. The teachers were not specifically trained for remedial teaching or teaching Bahasa Malaysia as a second language. The students, especially the Indian students, were marginalized in the lower classes. They had, because of all these things, they had very low self-esteem and were often labeled as academically poor students on account of their poor command in Bahasa Malaysia. It is very unfortunate that despite acknowledging Bahasa Malaysia among vernacular school children is poor, the government has announced that the students need not attend remove class if they so desire and move into Form 1 directly. The other important thing we must understand is, since they are from Tamil medium schools, they should be made adequate preparations to have the Tamil language taught to them at the secondary level. But this was not so in the secondary schools. In the secondary schools, mother tongue instruction in Tamil, I don't know about how it worked out for the Chinese students in national schools, but especially for Indian students, it was done in a very haphazard manner. In some instances, no arrangement was made for such classes. This is called the pupil's own language. These classes can only be considered if 15 or more students request for it. By the time they got the approval from the State Department, and then a part-time teacher was located and the school organized, a semester would pass by. Discrimination, racial abuse, and bullying of students is very common in the secondary schools, and the Indian students become the victims. There is also teacher apathy towards these children. They do not pay attention to these complaints from the students. In the secondary school, at least 81% of the teachers are from the majority ethnic race. And as such, there is ethnic bias when they handle these removed class students. There was a survey done by an NGO a few months ago, an NGO called Architects of Diversity Malaysia, on discrimination in education, which states that 92% of the students responded that no investigation took place after these kinds of incidents were reported to teachers. The next important thing is, you know that these children are coming from a mono-ethnic background. That means all Tamil children from the Tamil primary schools, they move to the secondary school, which is multi-ethnic in nature. And it is very daunting for them, because if they do not have proper support system, and if they do not have proper role models, the students tend to drop out of school because they're unable to cope with the new environment of the school and the different medium of instruction, and also now unsympathetic teachers. So they drop out. The best thing is for us to get out of school and do something else. There is also a high dropout rate among Indians in the secondary school. In 2016, it was reported that about 6,000 students dropped out of secondary school. On an average, every year, I think, about 7,000 or more students drop out of school. This is a very serious problem. As a result, dropouts end up in undesirable activities such as involvement in gangs, serious crime, and drug-related activities. In 2014, it was reported that 31% of arrests for violent crimes comprised of Indian youths. The unemployment rate among Indians is also high. It was also reported that 25% of Indians between the ages of 15 and 19 are in the unemployment group. They should by right be in the upper secondary schools or in some form of vocational technical schools. I think most, if not all, ethnic groups are language-centered cultures. They're all language-centered cultures. And it is an essential ethnic marker. If you talk about what is your, when I look at someone, I say, oh, he's Chinese, he's going to speak in Chinese, either Cantonese, Hokkien, or Mandarin, that's all. When you look at an Indian, you would say, they're also, if you look at a Tamil, you would say, oh, Tamil language. You look at the Malayalam is their language. You look at Telugu is a language. So everyone is identified through this language markers. So I think language is also one of the core values of an ethnic group in society. The Tamils also feel that language is an important symbol of their ethnicity. And language is one of the most important formative influences in molding the intellect as well as the character of the child. It has got a symbiotic relationship between language and culture. So on that basis, Tamil to the Indian population, Tamil speaking population is very, very important. A lot of their culture is embedded. A lot of their ethics and good values are embedded in their culture. You know, you look at the great traditions of the Indians, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, anything else. And even in Tamil Nadu, you would have your own Tamil reformers and Tamil saints who have written so much on ethics, on good behavior, on community living. Fantastic amount of literature in Tamil is available for the Tamil-speaking Indians in India. And so I think for us to say how important, I think it's very, very important. Just like the Chinese also value, they are also a language-based centered culture. So language is very important for us. If we lose our language, we lose our identity and we move into the periphery of any society. And so early education through the mother tongue is also advocated. Early education, primary education is advocated by psychologists, sociologists, and educationists because it has tremendous benefits for the child. The UNESCO report in 1951 also stated that the best medium of instruction for elementary schools and beginning children, education for children, is in their mother tongue. That is one of the things. I have read quite a lot of research on this topic, and I know we can confirm most of them say wherever possible, it must be started in the mother tongue. So mother tongue is important. There is no question about it. But in Malaysia, there is a lot of political posturing about doing away with mother vernacular school medium of instruction. But the reality is both the Chinese and Indian or the Tamil ethnic groups have very strong attachment to their mother language. This is very important for us to understand. In Malaysia, both these ethnic groups have what is referred to as ethno-linguistic vitality. That is important. What do I mean by ethno-linguistic vitality? It means you have a concentration of population of Chinese and Indians that is large enough to maintain their languages and cultures. Okay, and now if you look at it, with globalization, there is a threat to a common language policy. This one language, one people aspiration is not feasible. We must also gain proficiency in another language, and that is English language, as it is the language of global, it is a language of international commerce and trade and communication. So we must also learn to pick up English, or we will be left behind in the global scene. There is one book I read lately, which is by a professor called Kim Licka, K-Y-M-L-I-C-K-A, Kim Licka, called Multicultural Citizenship, a Liberal Theory of Minority Rights. It says that a vital ingredient for national unity and integration in plural societies is social justice and fair play. They said that is more important than organizing other things. Make sure that policies are fair, and there is social justice across all communities, the people will integrate by themselves. To conclude, I think this Indian students' problem is interrelated and multidimensional. Poverty is a major issue among them, and it is intertwined with poor academic performance of their children. Bahasa Malaysia language problems and transition to secondary school issues should be corrected for reorganizing Bahasa Malaysia curriculum in secondary schools to reflect its remedial aspects for ethnic minorities. A multi-pronged approach should be adopted to tackle their problems. Teacher diversity in national schools must be improved. At the moment, about 81% of their teachers are Bumiputra. Representation of other ethnic groups has to be increased to provide some kind of role models and acceptance of other children in the new environment. Most important, I think, a course on intercultural education or multicultural education must be made compulsory in all teacher training colleges. So they understand how to interact in a multicultural environment. What are the do's and don'ts? They should be able to know. So that course is compulsory for all teachers. The other things that are important that the Indian children must acquire is proficiency in ICT. This is an important capability for coming generations of relations. And also the students must become bilingual or even trilingual to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Education indeed has to play so many roles in a society to be able to prepare students for the complex world. Finally, I'd like to thank Dong Zong and the Chinese Education Group for this opportunity to talk about Tamil schools and their problems. I hope this will help the non-Indians understand the problems pertaining to Tamil education and Tamil society. Thank you.
Malaysia has always been a multi-ethnic, multicultural society. Since culture and education have an impact on each other, it is important for people of all cultures to value education and for the education system to value all cultures. Implementing multicultural education benefits not only individual students but also society as a whole. Multicultural education has long-term benefits for students because those who learn to appreciate and value the cultural diversity of their peers will ideally grow up to be adults who likewise promote equality and justice. Multicultural education exposes students to the different cultural values and beliefs, and helps to create understanding and acceptance of differences between people. All this helps students in deduction all the more basically, just as, wish them to have an increasingly open viewpoint. As a result, students are furnished with knowledge, values, and skills necessary to take part in social changes, resulting in justice for otherwise victimized and excluded ethnic groups.